Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. Yes, here we are. I'm recording. Hello.
Hi, Jeremy.
Hello. We've done no gaming.
Nope, because I'm gaming tonight.
No, and I'm testing out Aris again this weekend, and getting to the point where I need to just pull the trigger and get it out there. But yeah, so we could dispense with that.
Yes, because once you've released it, you'll be able to build one of them.
What do you mean?
Well, you're far on your picture, you're above me, but yeah.
Oh yeah, I'll build my secret base. Yeah. Oh no, totally, absolutely.
Forget your island with sand. You can build a secret bondler.
I will do that. I will do that. So today we're going to talk about, as a preface to our next episode, or some episode in hopefully the near future, we'll talk about the essential elements of James Bond and what makes Bond unique in spy and espionage stories, that overall genre. It fits within it, but what makes it unique? Because then we are going to work on an SRD powered one-on-one Bond game, which will then hopefully, if it works out, we like what we do, form the foundation of a one-on-one, one GM, one player 2D20 rules set.
Which I giving away one of the things that makes a Bond game.
What's up?
Giving away one of the things that makes a Bond game.
All right. Well, I want to tease people so that they want to listen to the rest of this episode, and then they want to listen to the next one. So where do we want to start? What are the essential elements of James Bond?
Gee, I can't think of any.
Hit it.
I just like, yeah, because I did have the girls up, didn't I? Let's go with your one. Yeah, the one of the most essential elements is a good villain, but not only. There's a bunch of let's start with villains, because villains is not just the villain. I think there's three things to the. Oh, maybe it's four. So there's the villain themselves.
Yep.
There's the villain's plan.
Yes,
that's important. The henchman.
Yes.
And then the thing behind you, the bad guy base.
Yeah.
Because I think in modern ones, I feel like we've lost like the bad guy base.
Yeah.
The bad guy, the evil villain's lair are built into a volcano. I know it became a joke in Austin Powers, but we're talking about things that make James Bond. And to me, those are the four ingredients just for the villain. Before we even get into everything else, the villain. And that's why I think some of the really good Bond films have really good villains and all of that stuff.
And there's a silliness to it, and there can be a campiness to it, and you just have to put that aside. I agree with you. And for those listening, I think our primary focus for Bond stuff is going to be the Connery Moore era. And I guess you could throw George Lazenby's On Her Majesty's Secret Service in there too. I'm going to pretend that the Timothy Dalton movies, by and large, don't exist. I'm not a fan of the Pierce Brosnan movies, but they still fit. The Daniel Craig ones they've really moved away. I think they're more espionage thrillers, like dark espionage thrillers, than Bond movies. So FYI, but I agree with you completely. The villain, there needs to be a solid villain. Almost, they're almost. I use the word campy already, but what's the word I'm looking for?
I mean, I think it depends. Like a lot of the Bond villains were sort of cerebral villains, and that's why a lot of Bonds had a henchman. But the Bond villains, Bond could beat them in a fight if it came down to
they didn't get their hands dirty.
But that's why you have a henchman. But they had properly evil plans. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm going to destroy everyone on the planet, and we're all going to live either in underwater cities or we're going to live in space, which is two classic Roger Moore ones. All right, one classic Roger Moore one, and Ray.
Do that,
but they have properly evil, but then they have evil bases. The guy in the Spy Who Loved Me is probably my favorite Bond film, that he has an underwater base. That's super cool. And then the other guy he basically has two bases. He has a base in a volcano in the Amazon, and because that wasn't good enough, he has a space station. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
So yeah,
Moonraker.
but they weren't. They were bad guys that were cerebral. They both almost killed James Bond because they put him into death traps, which of course they then explained their master plan and
Right.
let him escape them. Because that's what you do if you're a Bond villain. For some reason, you're incredibly clever, except when it comes to killing James
You
Bond.
can just pull the trigger.
Just put a bullet
So,
between his
but back to the villain. I think you hit on a good point. The villain is not the villain's not going to go toe to toe with Bond, and that's what necessitates the strange and violent henchmen,
Yes,
like Jaws
like Jaws.
or
Odd
uh,
Job.
what was the other one? Odd Job.
Odd Job's a classic one.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, you got to have the cerebral villain, and I think that the plan the plan has to be megalomaniacal
Yeah,
along with the villain. And the plan, in a weird way, I think the plan is almost like a character itself
yeah.
because it's so involved and it's so pervasive, and it's what ties the story together. And
Well, it's usually your entry point, isn't it? Bond will be
yeah,
sent to do one thing or investigate something, and then he finds that little thing that leads you on to the next thing. And then before you put the things together, and then you discover there's this big plan and the bad guy's going to do something really, really evil.
yeah,
Or in the case of one of the Pierce Brosnan's one, get media rights to China.
not very exciting.
No, I
Uh,
mean, I think they dropped the ball on that one.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's not evil.
Well,
That's
you
just
make a good point.
capitalist.
The if you think about, and I know you talk you make left-handed comments about Moonraker, but the opening scene in Moonraker, well, the opening like bad guy scene has the silly stealing the space shuttle. Why is that? Because Hugo Drax needs an extra Moonraker shuttle because like one of his was damaged or didn't something like there was so this thing happens which then in this which necessitates Bond's involvement, but it's not clear what's going on.
Yeah.
You Only Live Twice, which is my favorite of the movies. It starts out with there are spaceships. It's like a Gemini spacecraft is kidnapped, is stolen in space, hijacked and stolen in space by some nefarious third power that's playing the U.S. and the Soviet Union against one another. And so Bond obviously has to get involved and find out what the deal is. So the plot ends up being the the plot is the village plan laid out in such a way that that Bond can work through pieces of it and then put together the whole picture from these disparate puzzle pieces early on. And I think you're right about too that there needs to be there need to be interesting locations. Think about it. Bond goes to like cool places like Monte Carlo and cool casinos where he gets to play out people's like I don't know rich jet setter fantasies. But having something like the secret volcano base or a moon base or an underwater base, things like that, those are
Yeah.
all those I
That's
think are necessary. The the Bond bad guy doesn't have just like I don't know, he's not in a warehouse. He's not in a high-rise office building and that's it.
yeah. I think that's where I mean, to me, that's the Daniel Craig ones are good films in their own right, but you nailed it when you said they are espionage thrillers.
Yep.
They went, oh, people now want Jason Bourne. Let's do Jason Bourne with James Bond. And you kind of, well, we have Jason Bourne
Yeah.
or had. We don't need more Jason Bourne. So I'll be interested to see where they go with Bond. But yeah, it felt like they moved too much away because the villains aren't super memorable. I mean, they brought back Blofeld for 2 films because they ran out of bad guys. So the villains aren't super memorable, and they don't necessarily feel the need for henchmen anymore, and they don't have the crazy big base. Although the most recent one, he did actually have a secret villain lair on an island, so they are, occasionally sticking into that. And I think he did pretty much want to. I mean, actually, the most recent one, yeah, part of that he did want to destroy most of the world.
So
but then
the villain is that's what I was gonna say. I was gonna say like melodramatic or like vaudeville. There's almost as they push toward campiness and gonzo. The villains they have these bigger than life personalities. They have these far reaching world shaking plans. their dirty work is done by henchmen, and they have a base. Okay, so that's the villain side of must-haves in a real Bond film. What are some other must-haves? I can think of
Well, I
a
mean, you
few.
hinted one, so I want to go into that before we go to the other one. You kind of said actually that the locations as well as the Bond thing, actually the idea of jet setting. So, whereas in, I don't know, D&D, you just have different dungeon rooms and some other things you'd go through. You might be in a city. In a Bond film, you should really tick up, in an adventure, because obviously this is a plan to turn it into a role-playing game.
Yeah.
You need to have globe-trotting things, and they should be different.
Yes.
And the ending shouldn't be in Scotland, because that's not exciting.
No, it's not.
I mean, yeah, we want jungles, or we want big fancy cities, or
We
just,
want we want
the Day of
Jaws
the Dead
biting someone to death in the shadows of the pyramids.
exactly, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And actually, some of the recent ones did do cool stuff, like the one that starts off at the Day of the Dead celebrations in Mexico, and they collapse a building. Yeah, that's what I want to see.
Yeah.
I want to see like places that you go and go, I want to go there. Watching this makes me want to go to this place, or the opposite, where I've been there. I was like that in a film. I've been there. So yeah, you want exotic play, like you said, jet setting, exotic lifestyle. The whole point is, people want to be James Bond. So if he's traveling to exciting, exotic, faraway places, that's cool. If he's driving around the streets of London and then pops up to Scotland to hide, that's not exciting. I can do that.
It's not at all. Yeah, you know what I think? I think in an attempt to bring Bond back to Earth and make Bond seem more like gritty and human, you ruin Bond. So that's okay. So yeah, jet setting. You need to have these crazy, these bases or secret lairs or things like that. But you need to tick off some interesting places. Like again, in You Only Live Twice, there's a great scene where he goes and he meets up with the Japanese intelligence head Tiger Tanaka, and Tiger Tanaka takes him to this castle, this Japanese castle where there's like ninjas training and people with ninja stars and flamethrowers and all kinds of craziness like that. And then they make Sean Connery not look Japanese and all that.
That's so bad.
That's awesomely horrible, but that's what's so wonderful about it.
I was like, those are scenes that I think you should always have in a Bond film, but they wouldn't be relevant in a game. But that scene where you walk in and all those people are testing out gadgets that Bond doesn't get. It's the gadgets that Q Branch are testing,
right?
But they're not for Bond. They're just that scene where he walks through.
Just going on. You need that, or you need the danger room where people are.
The snake charming thing.
But you're right. There need to be mundane locations in the real world that are of high interest or out of reach of the vast majority of people.
Yeah.
And you need to put those in there because there is there's that fantasy element to Bond where Bond becomes our viewpoint character for dreaming like what would it be like if I walked into that casino in Monte Carlo.
And I think that links back to the villain thing, because you can have an opening scene where Bond's doing a completely separate thing, which used to always be completely separate. It was only in sort of more recent Bonds where the opening scene would link to the rest of the film. But so you can have that opening scene which can be completely irrelevant. But after, Bond wants to go to one country to look for one thing, and that sends him to another country, which sends him to another country. Because you can do that because we have air travel, and air travel is relatively quick. So, as long as you don't set the time limit for 24 hours from the start.
So globetrotting, jet setting, interesting places. Okay. Obviously, this one's so obvious, but you have to have gadgets.
Yes,
and not just like the Mission Impossible films have things that you would qualify, I think, as gadgets.
But they have one gadget. Actually, they're not about, but that I think it was Mission Impossible 2 where they got really silly, where you didn't have a clue who was playing who because everyone was using fake masks, including the bad guys. But that's about it.
That kind of stuff is just like high tech.
Yes.
Okay. The idea, and you've got it over your shoulder there, of the Lotus that's also a submarine. That's what we're talking about in terms of gadgets. The actually the weapon that ends it, that kills Hugo Drax, or almost does, the little like wrist shooter thing, little dart shooter. The buzz saw, circular saw in the watch. the cigarettes that shoot, little rockets and things like that. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about gadgets. We're not talking about something that is, like plausibly high tech. We're like you'd see on a show like Leverage. We're
Yeah.
talking about weird, strange things.
When they went really over the top and they did the invisible car, that's when people went, well, this is stupid. You're like, well, it is, but
Yeah.
it's still fun.
Yeah. So gadgets. What
Yes, you
else?
need
What else is
lots of gadgets.
absolutely necessary?
I know it's not very PC, and I did have the picture, but I've changed it. But you need Bond girls. There
Yeah.
needs to be a love interest. Now, do they have to have an inappropriate and silly pun name? Probably not, because that's Austin Powers. And when we were going through some of these names earlier, we was just thinking, how did they ever? I mean, some of them aren't even. I actually would say some of them aren't even that actually, but that one, the one we talked about earlier, I realized that's actually from Moonraker. That is still in the 80s. That is very old. But even the Pierce Brosnan ones, I mean, that was the mid 90s, and we had Xenia on a top.
Yeah,
which is still, that's more of a pun. That's not terrible, but yeah. Actually, I'm sure Denise Richards' character is pretty.
Probably had a stupid name too.
I'm sure, because
wasn't she like a nuclear physicist or something?
Yeah,
like that?
and I think her surname was like
character
Christmas or something. So
Jiminy Christmas.
Because I think they do the whole Christmas only comes once a year. You're just like, oh God, no.
Okay, so
why did you go there?
So there needs to be a girl, because James Bond is male, and James Bond is straight. That's all the Ian Fleming. That's what we've got. I'm working off canon here, folks. And so you've got Bond girls. Okay. Now I
would throw that there. If you, because we've said we're doing this 1-to-1. If you were doing this 1-to-1 and you happen to be playing someone that would prefer it, that they want to be romancing men, then fine. So at the end, if we switched it to a female Bond or a gay Bond, that wouldn't change it. So, but there needs to be a love interest. Well, actually, no, that's not the right word, is it? Because there's no love.
No, it's a sex interest. I was thinking about that actually a little while ago. Like, let's just be honest here, and let's just call it sex interest. Yeah. So but here's the thing though, is that the sex interest is not just it's not just like if it's female and it's James Bond, it's not just some bunny. It's like she's a nuclear physicist, or she's a pilot, or she's a spy herself, or whatever. The interesting thing about
most cases they're not damsels in distress. Very rarely. But even right back to the first, Ursula Andress, she wasn't I can't remember her name, but she wasn't a damsel in distress. She was on that island fishing for things with a nice big spear gun and stuff. Right. So, I know Bond girls get a bad rep, but yeah, they tend to be decent characters. Okay, they all fall for James Bond.
All of them have. I think this is the important point: is that the sex interest or sex interests, and we can talk about how to play that out. We'll talk about that in the next episode. But they all are competent and skilled in some way.
Yes.
They're not, like you said, they're not just damsels in distress. In fact,
I think the better ones. There's been the odd film where they really were just useless. And
but
I think
sometimes those are like the secondary ones. Those are the ones where like the opening scene where Bond is just in the sack with someone and there isn't anything else to them. The vast majority of them otherwise are they have some a degree of skill and competence that makes them fit into the spy story. You're not wondering like, what the heck are you? Where'd you come from? Okay. What else, if anything else? I have some ideas.
Go on, because I feel like that's the key elements of Bond. So go on then.
Okay, I have like two things, and one of them kind of pushes toward game sorts of things.
Yeah.
Bond. It's silly that this seems absurd. Bond's gonna win. And Bond, although Bond will have assistance, James Bond never completely. In none of these movies did James Bond totally do it all by himself, but James Bond is not part of a team.
No, that's a good one. That's the we talked about it previously, isn't it?
And like for example, in this in You Only Live Twice, there is a team of like ninjas who show up with Tiger Tanaka and the spy girl at the end who assist, but really it's Bond who makes it happen.
Yeah,
And
I
so
think
I
there's,
think
there's
that's
quite
really, and that's one of the things that differentiates Bond from something like Mission
Mission Impossible.
Impossible.
Yeah.
It's about him, really. It's about that character. That character makes it happen at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think there might be, like you said, ones where the enemy has an army. That's often when Bond will turn to, like, whichever special forces of the country he's in,
Right.
and his friendly army will help out. But they're really there to take out the other troops. They're not there to take out. He's still gonna have to fight the henchmen. He's still
like the
have to stop the
submarine
bad guy.
crews in your much beloved The Spy Who Loved Me. The submarine crews are then pressed into service as part of that they go ahead and fight and help defeat, but it's still Bond is the motive force.
And I think there are the odd film, there's been a bunch of Felix Leiters, but he seems to die a lot, but come back. But he's there to maybe provide information and to tail someone, but actually he's more likely he's there to get into trouble and have to be rescued than he's actually there to provide a benefit. And that's occasionally there are more capable, like you said, spies that help out, but again, a lot of the time they might be more likely to get into trouble and Bond's got to save them, as opposed to they're not going to solve the mission if Bond doesn't step in.
Right.
So they're not again, they're not really a player character, which is why you said that Bond really needs to be a one-on-one game.
Yeah,
there is one single main point of view character, and that's it. That's James Bond. So one-on-one.
And the trouble is that if you decide to change that and say, okay, well, it's going to be Bond, and someone's going to play Felix Leiter, and someone's going to play insert strange, moderately inappropriate name for female spy lead, whatever, then the three of those players are going to be probably sharing screen time, which then degrades from so it's got to be solo. The other thing I was going to add is that when it comes to gadgets and equipment, it tends to be, aside from a sidearm, aside from the ever-present pistol, if you ever notice Bond's gonzo equipment, he usually only uses once.
That's a very good point.
Those are, I mean, think about it. Like you don't have,
you've said it.
Bond doesn't have, in any movie, he doesn't have a signature piece of equipment that he uses again and again. It's
even the cars will be used for one scene.
Right.
And then he's escaped, or he's got in, or he's got away, or he's chased them, and then they're destroyed, or he doesn't use them again.
Yeah, like in Moonraker, that silly scene when Roger Moore is in his he has the hovercraft gondola in in Venice. You never see it again. Bond is given in Moonraker that little wrist dart shooter thing, and he shoots the horse in the picture when he's handed the thing, and then, well, actually no, that one he used twice, because he used it when he was in the centrifugal, the spinner test thing. He used that to blow up the instrument panel to make it stop, and then he zapped Hugo Drax in the chest and sent him out the airlock. So that one he used twice, but everything else, like the little helicopter in You Only Live Twice.
Yeah, he used it once. Yeah, literally go up, shoot some stuff, comes back down,
use it once. So most of those things, the cars, I mean, it's not unusual at all for him to have a cool car with all kinds of gadgets and things in it, but he's not going to use it again and again and again. It's not like He-Man and his sword, where that's what, like, at a point, or Thundar and his stupid sun sword, or what's his face, from the Thundercats, thunder, the sword grows and all that stuff. And so you're waiting for that, He uses these things once, which actually I think works, because I started stewing up an idea of there would be things that would be equipment that would be available, and you'd use them for one scene.
Yeah, I think you're right. The stuff that we've said, like other things have, like Mission Impossible. So, Bond does have those. He probably has a tracker in his watch, and he probably has a communication device and something in his shoe. Those would be the kind of things that they might have multiple uses. But everything else is, gadgets that they're one-off. You're right. Most things are just one-off uses,
which fit well with this whole like scene economy of 2D20. I
Yes.
think, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be interesting whether you could kind of do a flashback thing where you realize you really need a particular gadget for
Mm.
this. And then you could do rather than doing, you've done a Q scene where Q has given you everything you need. You could at that point do a flashback to the earlier scene where Q has given you something, or because the GM writes everything and the GM knows what's going to be needed,
Yeah.
the GM can give the player a bunch of stuff. The player won't necessarily know when they're going to need certain stuff, but they know they've been given, a rope, a garroting thing, and an electric and a lock picking thing. The player will then have to work out what's the right time to use these things. But actually, then there's a whole nother element of a kind of a game thing. If each of these things are only going to work once, because
For one
that's
scene.
what happens in James Bond thing, that would be quite a good puzzle for a player to think, oh, when
I
do I
actually,
get
I
to use
think you
these?
just made me think of something. And we've talked about this. We talked about this a while ago when we talked about Night's Black Agents, the gumshoe game. Night's Black Agents has you have a general ability, which is scored in points, called preparedness. And to use preparedness in NBA, you would say you realize that, like, you need a lockpick kit. You're like, okay, well, I'm going to pull out my lockpick kit. And you never said that you had one, but you'd have a pool of points for preparedness, and you would choose to spend some of those points to modify a die roll. So if you roll, you see, okay, I got my lockpicks. So now I can use them. And what that does is it does two things that I think are really useful in that kind of story, like spy story. It provides the character, the player and the character, with equipment that they need in the moment, okay? And it also accounts for the inevitability of stuff happening that the GM cannot forecast.
Yeah, I think that's when it would be useful, because I think, if the GM's planned it out, it's super railroady,
Yeah.
which, when you watch a Bond film, most Bond films are, then you can have Q Branch give Bond all the stuff he's going to need. The player just doesn't realize it. But because it's not a script, it's a role-playing game, and
Yeah.
players do stupid stuff. I think we probably are better going back to some kind of resource that you can spend to get gadgets that you need. And we have a
Well, you
couple,
could do
because we have,
both.
we have fortune points, and yes, good point. We have
You could do
fortune
both.
points, and we have momentum that we
Yep.
can spend to to do stuff. So you can
You know what?
have
I
Bond.
could see leaving momentum intact by and large. Momentum is so central to 2D20. So you leave momentum as it is. Maybe you adjust some of the point spends, but momentum's going to do what momentum's going to do. You could have something, your fortune points could be, one of the spends for a fortune point could be to invoke an asset. That's what I'm calling it. That's what I was thinking of. Like, there'd be a difference between either traits and truths, whichever word you want to use for them, and then there'd be an asset. And an asset would be something like the gadget you need in that moment, which you would, that I actually, I think there's a place for both, because you as GM could come up with what you thought were cool equipment, and then you see, well, how will my player use this cool equipment? But then
Yeah.
you want to leave that narrative space for the player to say, what I need is a shoe that, is a boomerang or something absurd like
I
that.
was just thinking the same
I
thing.
need a shoe that, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I think something like a car, that's going to be a scene. You've designed this scene where the Bond's got a cool car and the bad guys
Right.
are doing something. That needs to be something that Q
And you
Branch
know
can know
that, and
ahead
you've
of
already
time.
set up a car chase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when players go off rails, they do need the opportunity to do other things. Another thing you could count as an asset as well, because obviously an asset could be a gadget, but it could be a person in terms of a contact. Because there's quite a few times that,
Yes.
Bond rocks up to some country and there's someone there he already
Yep.
knows. He's already, he gets in contact with the person there that he happens to know that he met on another
Right.
mission, which of course you've never seen. And so, that could be
Well, it could,
another spec of something.
an asset, and here we are bleeding over into mechanics, but an asset could be, it could be information or a means to get information.
Yeah.
It could be a piece of equipment, or it could be support.
Yeah.
Because again, back to You Only Live Twice, the ninja team that shows up at the strike team that shows up at the end and helps, win the battle, that was an asset. So then the question is, how do you work up mechanics to allow for those things? But I think that 2D20, because of that scene based economy, um,
I
I
mean, there's
think
clearly other,
actually
like
would.
the fact that you mentioned Knight's Black Agent. That's an example of a system that clearly could do this quite well. Something like, although we don't not big keen, something like
Yeah.
Fate or Cortex could do this very easily as well because they kind of have those kind of meta currencies. If for some reason you were going to do it in 5e, and although we could laugh at this, I'm pretty sure both of us own the 5e spy role playing.
We do.
Which I bought and then I don't think I've read. So yeah, genius. That was a
I've
brilliant
read it.
purchase.
It's
Well done.
actually pretty decent, but I mean, it's 5e, so I mean, there are limitations, but
But again, you could if they don't have something already built in for this, you can shoehorn it in. But yeah.
Well, what else? Is there anything else that we can say you must have it or must think about this at least?
I mean, I think all the villains are super important, but actually that's more of an adventure planning thing. So that mostly falls on the GM.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in kind of trying to think more system things, not just 2d20s in general, is how you have to, because actually, so in a lot of, if I was going to do Mission Impossible or something similar, I would want to make sure that different players were good at different things. I want to have a player that can do hacking and a guy that's good at melee
Leverage.
combat.
The 18.
And exactly, yeah. I want something that can do all that. But actually, if you're doing Bond, well, Bond can do everything. Bond can drive cars and he can ski and he knows like half the languages in the world, and he can, when he needs to, hack computers to a certain degree. So I almost think you need a kind of like you wouldn't need your standard like 6 stats and 6 skills kind of system. You almost want something completely different. And we can think about more about that for next week. But
yeah,
you certainly have a lot of opened up possibilities because the idea, you don't have that thing like, oh, well, look at your character sheet. Can your character do that? Well, it's Bond. So the answer is yes. He's never been on a snowboard before, but that didn't stop him when he needed to jump on.
I think
because
Bond can do most anything. However, we obviously see the need for your gadgets, so we see the need for support characters. The question is, how do you account for Bond's broad high level of competence, and then also where do you decide to fill in or make up for any kind of needs that he has? Because this is also going to require, I don't know why I didn't think about this before, but I just did. This will also require, if we're going to make this work, we're going to have to create Bond.
Yeah, which makes it very,
which makes the game, I mean, in a weird way, kind of easy, because you're like, well, it's the GM and here's your character.
Yeah, it makes me think of something like you don't need something with all of the attributes and skills and stats and everything else. You want more something like if we're talking 2d20 anyway, but again, we'll get onto this next episode. But something maybe more John Carterish, where all you have is 6 like sort of attributes that go added together when you're doing stuff. Because we don't need separate skills. We know Bond is good at physical stuff, and then we know he's good at shooting and he's good at romancing women. And if you statted him D&D style, well, okay, he's probably hitting really high stats on everything apart from strength, but then he'd be above average on that. He just wouldn't be through the roof. So then it kind of becomes, well, this is a bit pointless then, really, is it? You do need some kind of thing, because you need to be able to show that other people are stronger. Like you've always got the bad guy who is stronger, and you've got the bad guy that's more intelligent. But people aren't more charismatic, and they're not necessarily, there's all that. So he's up there, but there's people who are better. But I think you could probably just get away with maybe just like physical attributes, and I'm not sure you need this. You need skills for NPCs. Either that or Bond just has a talent that says, Bond can do everything except in small print. He can disarm a nuclear bomb as long as there's someone on the phone telling him how to do it.
Yeah. I think that statting up, coming up with stats and how you would stat up Bond. I think those two things you have to take in you have to consider those two things together. I don't think that a traditional selection of stats and skills is, I don't know if it would work.
No,
because you would end up having to load up Bond with so many different skills to account for things. I maybe, and this, we'll talk about this in more detail when we get to that next step, but maybe you have the foundation of what Bond is all the time, but then you have on an adventure by adventure basis, the player is able to invoke deeper skill or ability in different areas, which then gives a little bit of a challenge, because Bond is not always, he's obviously not always great or better at everything than his opponents. And so there has to be a challenge. He can't be great at everything all the time, or it's boring. So maybe you end up having a selection of, like, here are all the different Bond things that Bond can do, but you can only invoke some of those in a given session or per scene or something like that.
And it might be the kind of thing, to use 2D20 speak, where you have a very narrow set of attributes and skills. Having said don't do them, if you look at the 6 standard ones in, like, sort of Dishonored has, might only have 4 actually. No, it has 6. And the World Builders thing, it's a very narrow thing. And you can use focuses. And in that case, Bond wouldn't be as good as someone who is, because maybe he doesn't have many focuses. Maybe he has very high skill levels, but he has no focuses. So he doesn't have, he's good, but he's not as good as someone who's spent all their life working on this particular field. He's a really good shot and he's really good at fighting, but he's not as good as someone who has a focus in katanas, because they've practiced using them. And so actually, again, within the 2D20 and other systems will have similar things, but I think you want a very narrow skill pool, because essentially he's going to be brilliant at everything.
If you watched all the movies and you went through and you're like, what did Bond do really well at? And you'd have a list a mile long, and that'd be silly.
So I think you need a very narrow list of, he's driven and piloted virtually every single vehicle, including spacecraft, with very little difficulty.
Sure. Okay. All right. So then what we need to do is, you and I just need to think on our own about what general approach in the SRD would we take to character creation, because I think you're right. I think that you can nail down so many issues about rules if you start off with character creation.
But I think we've covered the kind of main things, haven't we? So we've got villains and all their sub bits of villains. Girls, gadgets, locations, and then again the idea he's not a team player.
No.
So you need to go 1-to-1, which is what you wanted to do. So and I think that's it. I think I think that's the key elements.
All right. So now we need to think on our own and share ideas, and then come back together and work on the foundation of taking the SRD and making this go somewhere. Very cool. All right. Thank you so much for listening. You can visit our show's homepage at anchor.fm/fluffncrunch. That's FLUFFNCRUNCH. We would really appreciate feedback and reviews on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to this on. Thanks so much.